Hello, and welcome to Charted, an astrology podcast. My name's James, and today we're going to talk about the houses, or more specifically, the house systems in astrology. So what I want to do with this episode specifically is look at kind of a broad overview of the house system in general, get a sense for why it's important, why we use it, where it kind of came from, all that kind of stuff. And then from there, the following episodes, we'll just look at each house individually. Because the houses are really the last component we haven't really looked at yet on the podcast that is crucial to practicing and understanding astrology. So let's dive in. So where did the houses come from? Right? This is going to be an astronomy thing. And I apologize if a little bit of this gets a tiny bit technical and boring. But I'm going to try to avoid the more mathy type stuff to the best I can. But the houses in specific get very, very math intensive once you try to look at how things are calculated and so on. So I'm going to try to avoid that as best as possible. So what are the houses? Well, where did they come from? When we talked about the origin of the zodiac, right, back one of the early episodes, the zodiac is essentially us dividing the sky into 12 quadrants, right? But it's the sky as we see it from one of two rotations, that rotation being the rotation of the Earth around the sun, i.e. the Earth's orbit, right? So as the Earth orbits the sun, it moves through space, moves around the sun in space, and it changes our perspective of space. And so how the space around us and where things are oriented based on our location changes, right? If you're standing on a merry-go-round, right, and going around in a circle, and you're watching somebody that's not on the merry-go-round, where they are in relation to you, right? Are they to your left, to your right, in front of you, behind you? That's going to change as you move around that circle. And so that's essentially what the zodiac is doing, or kind of how we are looking at it from our perspective on Earth. And so we divided that into 12 quadrants, right? You get the 12 signs, and those are static. They don't change amongst themselves, but things can pass through them, such as the planets, the sun, the moon, and so forth. But they more or less stay right where they are in space. It's just our positioning, the other planet's positioning changes amongst that space. So that's the first rotation. The second rotation is the rotation of the Earth on its axis, right? What does that mean? It means the Earth is spinning, right? It spins on the axis of the North and South Pole. That's what gives us the day and night cycle. The zodiac is based off of the Earth's orbit, and therefore it's based off of the seasonal cycle, right? Aries, the cardinal signs, Aries, Libra, Capricorn, Cancer, are based off of the spring and fall equinox and the summer and winter solstice, right? They mark important points in the seasonal cycle in terms of the position of the sun, how long and short the days are, right? Whether they're growing longer, growing shorter. And so that's where that originated. For the houses then, they are used to essentially divide up the quadrants of sky based on the rotation of the Earth as it spins. So this is the second rotation. This is why we have houses and the zodiac, and they're different. They don't equate to each other. They represent different things because, again, they represent different orientations, different rotations of the Earth. So the day-night cycle, right, what do we notice about? Well, the first thing is if you look to the east, you will notice everything rises to the east. It always rises from the east, goes up above us into the sky, and then as it crosses kind of, that 90-degree upwards point of us roughly, it then moves down and across over to the west, and then it sets and goes below the Earth, where it then proceeds right around the bottom and comes back up on the east again the next day. That's essentially the basis for the houses, right? The ancient astrologers were able to look and notice that kind of obvious fact that everything always rises in the east. And so they marked that, and then from there, divided essentially that area, both of the sky above us and the ground below us, as kind of the 12 quadrants, that similar to the zodiac, right? They kept it in 12. So the ascendant, that's going to be the eastern horizon. And this is where we get the angles. The angles are super important in astrology. They're considered very important points. I'm not going to really talk about their meanings in this episode, but they're super important for the houses specifically because they mark things, particularly the ascendant. The midheaven can be floating depending on the house system you're using, but we'll get to that in a moment. So the ascendant, that's going to be the eastern horizon, right? Because the horizon is flat. That therefore means the opposite angle, the descendant, where everything now descends on the western horizon, is going to always be in opposition to the ascendant. So if you have the ascendant at 15 degrees exact, you will have the descendant at 15 degrees exact of the opposite sign, or of the opposite, 180 degrees away. And so that's the first angle. And the ascendant is going to mark the first house, always. It will always mark the first house, right? Because that's the beginning point. That's where everything essentially exists. We don't know about something until it comes up above the horizon, essentially. Especially in ancient times, they would have had no concept of something until it came above the horizon. That's where the sun comes up. That's where the first light of day hits. Very important. Now, the other angle, or other two angles, I should say, are the midheaven and the imam, I think it's cholai or kolai, the IC for short, right? And these are not quite as clear-cut as the ascendant. So what is the midheaven? The midheaven, in kind of broad terms, without getting too mathy, is essentially going to be the top of the sun's arc in the sky at any given moment. But it's not exactly that. It's technically the where the ecliptic meets kind of a mathematical angle. Like I said, it gets kind of mathy, but essentially you can think of it as kind of the top of the ecliptic path that everything is taking through the sky. So what does that mean? It means that based on where you are at on Earth, the midheaven is going to be either closer to 90 degrees above you, or possibly, right, further over to the side or further over to the other side. And if you're at extreme latitudes, that means that the midheaven could be very close to the horizon, right? Say within 30 degrees, 40 degrees, or to the descendant, either way. And this is because of the math involved. And like I said, without being able to visually show it, it's not worth explaining. I don't think it's just too much complex stuff. But essentially, you're going to be drawing a bunch of angles and arcs and things like that, and then you kind of calculate out where the midheaven is based on where these kind of different arcs intersect the ecliptic. What's the ecliptic? That's essentially just the flat plane that the sun is on and where things kind of orbit the sun. So that's, as we watch the Earth spin, things kind of spin along the ecliptic, right? That's kind of the central axis point. So the midheaven then is kind of a floating point. It's never going to be exactly above you. It's never going to be 90 degrees. But it will often be, for people that live kind of, right, more center of the Earth, roughly, it will tend to float around 90 degrees from the ascendant. But for all purposes, we can just assume it's the top of the sun's arc, right? That's a very, that's not the exact definition, but that's a broad strokes kind of definition. If you draw a line straight through the Earth from the midheaven, you get the IC, right? And that's kind of the reverse point. Now, when it comes to the ways we divide up these 12 quadrants, right? This is where things kind of get weird. The original, or I don't know if it was the original, but certainly one of the earliest forms of house systems was to simply mark whatever sign that the ascendant was in, consider that whole sign the first house, and then every successive house consider it, right, equal to whatever the sign. That was the whole sign system. That would have been if it wasn't the original, it was certainly one of the earliest house systems because it's really easy to calculate. You've already got 12 divisions of the zodiac, right? You just assign one house per sign, and boom, you only have to do one calculation, and that's it. Away you go. And it was easy to follow because a lot of that stuff was based on, right, different stars, at least initially. That was the way they kind of tracked it. So that would have been one of the earliest house signs or house systems. Another one would have been equal signs, which would have been essentially taking the ascendant and then simply marking 30 degrees, right, from the ascendant. So if you had the ascendant at, say, 15 degrees of Capricorn, right, 30 degrees later, you would have had 15 degrees of Aquarius. That would have marked the second house, and so forth. That leads us to the next definition, the house cusps. A cusp of something just means the edge, right? So the house cusps are simply the starting point of a house. So if you have, say, the 6th house cusp, right, in Virgo, at 10 degrees, that just means the 6th house is beginning at 10 degrees of Virgo, right? And so the equal house system and subsequent house systems after that would have used wherever the ascendant was, whichever sign it was in, it would have marked that degree as the first house cusp, which meant you could, in theory, have part of a sign that was in the 12th, because the 12th will kind of be the last house, right, in that kind of full circle. So you would have 1, then 2 would be slightly beneath the earth, right, be below the first house, and then 3, and then 4 would be kind of down south below your feet. 5, 6, 7th would be the western horizon, and then so forth, going all the way around to 12. And so depending on how, right, there's different ways people kind of came up with trying to calculate out these different quadrants. Because one of the things people ran into is something called long and short ascension. Essentially, because the Earth is tilted, right? It's tilted, and that's part of what gives us our very kind of fluctuating seasons as it orbits the sun. This tilt means that certain parts of the year and certain signs in specific take longer or shorter periods of time as they kind of cross into view, as they ascend into view over the ecliptic as the Earth spins. And so what happens is you don't get exactly 30 degrees for each sign, right, in terms of what you can visibly see. And so this caused a lot of problems because it meant that things weren't always quite as equal. You weren't equally dividing what you could see into sections of 30 degrees. Or into 12 equal quadrants. It was kind of slightly off. And so that's what spawned a lot of additional house systems, right? And most of them would use the midheaven as that, is kind of the 10th house cusp. Also then the 4th house being the IC. And so what you get then is the quadrant house systems kind of spawned from that. So the equal house system, the whole sign system, I think there might be one other one I'm missing in there. But essentially, they use one set of angles, right? The ascendant and descendant axis, and that's really the only thing that notes the different houses. The quadrant house systems use both sets of angles because it essentially divides the zodiac, the house system into 4. And so people came up with various calculations for dividing that up, right? One of the simplest would have been simply looking at those angles, dividing the 4 quadrants, and then simply making each house within that equal. Right? The math gets really complex really quickly, so I don't want to get too into the weeds on that. But essentially, we came up with a lot of different ways to calculate that out. And so that begs the question, right? Which one do we use? Personally, I use the whole sign system, right? The reason being is because it has a very logical flow, much like, right, the zodiac. There is certain logic to the way that the houses were composed that essentially kind of flows with everything. It makes sense. It's not to say that the other house systems don't work, because they certainly do, and a lot of astrologers have found tremendous success using other systems. And personally, I'm a big fan of looking at the very least, the house cusps, even within the whole sign system. I find there's a lot of value in that. I don't do it all the time, but slowly I've been kind of looking at it more and more as I go. But then that begs the question of which house system do you use? And really it comes down to looking at the math of how they're calculated, and then just practice, right? Trying different ones out. And so this is an area that I think a lot of astrologers tend to argue about, right? What's the correct house system? You're going to get a lot of different answers from a lot of people. I would say use what works, and that's where you should end up. Placidus is currently very popular in modern Western astrology. Whole sign is making somewhat of a comeback with kind of the resurgence of Hellenistic astrology. But again, it's preference, I think, for the most part, so long as you can make it work, right? If you can do what is necessary based on the houses, right? If a reading makes sense based on the house system you're using, then I would certainly advocate for continue using what works, because what works will always trump what sounds the best every time. So, some other things about the houses. Even though, right, like I said, I use the whole sign system. Even though I use the whole sign system, there is something in modern astrology that is a problem. And that I'm not sure where this originated. Certainly it was sometime, I want to say with the initial resurgence of astrology in the West. And I'm not sure if it was a calculation thing or where along the lines it kind of happened. I haven't been able to pinpoint it. But essentially what people started doing was equating the first house is also equal to the significations of Aries. And this is problematic, right? Not just Aries, but successively, right? So the second house is equal to Taurus, third house is equal to Gemini, fourth house is equal to Cancer, and so forth. This is problematic because not only is it honestly kind of inaccurate in terms of what the houses represent, but it distorts meanings of the signs themselves. And so you lose a lot of meaning both with the signs and with the houses. And let's take an example right? So Aries, people say Aries is equal to the first house, right? You can kind of look at the meaning or an interpretation for a planet in Aries versus a planet in the first house, and you'll get the same thing. No, that's not correct at all. Because the first house represents the self. And Aries represents what? Action, self-actualization. Aries is direct. It wants to go forward. It wants to start things. But if your first house is in, say, right, Taurus, right, that's a very not wanting to start things. So a planet in Taurus is going to act very differently than a planet in Aries. And so this is where these kind of things fall apart. And I could go into it more in depth, but I don't think it's necessary. But essentially, this is something, if you see people advocating for this, ignore that. It's not good. It, as I said, it loses a lot of meaning amongst things. Now, there's certainly resonance, I would say, at least for Aries rising, amongst where the signs kind of are. Certainly some resonance, but it's not a 100% fit, and this is the problem. You lose so much nuance by equating the signs equal to the houses. Now, some other things with the house system, or with the houses. What do they represent specifically? Right? What is it about? The zodiac signs kind of show the flavor of how the planets are operating. But what do the houses show us? Well, the houses show us essentially the areas of life that things are affecting. So if you have, for example, right, a Mars-Saturn square in, say, Aquarius and Taurus, right? Where you have that in the houses will show the areas of life that tension is happening, right? If you just look and see the square, you'll know, okay, I have tension, right, based on these things using this setup, right? Saturn in its own sign, it's very eclectic, good social boundaries, but Mars is frustrated, it's in Taurus, and it's squaring Saturn, right? So you've got this frustration. But what area of life does it affect? Well, Taurus doesn't tell you an area of life. Aquarius doesn't tell you an area of life. It just tells you the kind of way it tends to play out in terms of thematics, right? Aquarius is very social. It's very intellectual. So it's going to be about intellectual, social boundaries. And Mars and Taurus are going to be about acting within the physical world. Right? And so that's where you see that tension, but that doesn't tell you the area of life. If you have it in, say, the 4th and the 1st house, this could probably be family. That's part of that dynamic. And so this is where the houses kind of really give a lot of personal value to us, right? They show things where they happen specifically and what they're affecting in a very personal level. The zodiac is out in space. It's far from the earth, right? You could think of it in a lot of ways, kind of the beyond. But the houses are what's locally around us. And so in that way, they're going to be much more personal to us specifically. I think a good way to think of the houses is kind of like if the planets are actors and the zodiac signs are kind of like the costume, the setting, right? Is it a Western? Is it a drama? Is it a romantic comedy? What kind of a movie is it? And the planets are the actors. The houses are like the scene, right? Is it the scene that's, the climax? Is it the beginning of the movie? Kind of the interlude, right? It's going to show where specifically the actors are acting things out according to their kind of different themes that they have going on. So that's what the houses generally represent. Now, the houses are set up in traditional astrology. They're set up in kind of 3 different ways. You have angular, which would be the ascendant, the descendant, right? 1st, 7th. The 10th, which is traditionally where the midheaven would mark the 10th, and then the 4th, where the IC would mark it. And now, in the whole sign system, keep in mind, you can have, or systems that don't use the quadrant houses, you'll have a free-floating midheaven. So your midheaven might not actually be in your 10th house if you're not using a quadrant system, right? Or using a house system that requires that the 10th start from the midheaven. So I do want to throw that one clarification out. But the 10th house, the 4th house, the 1st house, and the 7th house, those are the angular houses. Then you have what are called the succedent houses because they succeed an angular house. So for example, if we look at the 1st house, right, it's the eastern horizon, what succeeds it? What comes after the 1st? It's going to be the 2nd. Right? The 2nd house rises up from the 1st, or behind the 1st. It's succeeding it. So the succedent houses are typically considered kind of more beneficial, right? More advantageous. Whereas the angular houses are the kind of the most potent. They tend to see the most action. They represent the most important areas of life, most prominent areas of life. And they tend to be, when you have planets in those houses, tend to be much more potent, powerful, right? They're going to show a lot of activity. The succedent houses tend to show areas of life that are a bit more positive, right? That tend to have a lot more good going for them. This is going to be the 2nd house. It's going to be the 8th, which kind of a lone exception there. It's going to be the 5th and the 11th. Then you have the cadent houses. Now, the cadent houses are the ones that came before, right? They came before the angle. So if we look at the horizon, the 1st house, what came before the horizon? It would be the 12th house. The 12th came before the first, right? Because it's a prior circle. And so the cadent houses are kind of seen as weak, ineffective, right? That's using kind of the traditional terms, but essentially they're the houses that deal with more awkward stuff. They're not kind of getting second place, right? Supporting kind of the powerful angular houses. They're kind of diminished, right? Because they've already passed. Their time has already come, and now we've moved beyond it, right? So the cadent houses are seen typically as more difficult, and I would say generally speaking they are. The cadent houses are going to be the 3rd, the 6th, the 9th, and the 12th. Now, different houses have different levels of difficulty, if you want to call it that. Certainly some are more challenging than others, but that's not to say all houses are purely good or purely bad, right? The 5th house is generally seen as one of the more beneficial houses, but the thing is just like anything else in astrology, if you have poor ruler of the 5th house, maybe you've got malefics in the 5th house, things can be very challenging in that area of life, even though what it represents tends to be more soft, more benefic, right? The last thing is going to be the house joys. This is going to be the last thing I cover about the houses kind of in this episode is what are the house joys? Well, essentially different planets were assigned, right, a particular house that they found their joy in, right? It was a house that was very in tune with what that planet represented. So what were the house joys? Well, the first house would have been the joy of Mercury, right? Why? Because the first house represents, and again, we're going to talk about this as we go through them, right? What we see first, right? It's the face, it's the kind of I don't want to say public image, it's more of a 10th house thing, but it's kind of what people meet. It's who you are in kind of the day-to-day, and honestly, it's the initial framework. You could think of, if we think of your whole chart is kind of like a ship, right? The first house is the shape of the ship. That's how people know what it is. It's therefore going to be the thing people interact with. And what did we say Mercury represented when we talked about Mercury? It's the filter. It's the go-between between the soul and the physical body, right? It's the thing that intermediates between the world and the self. And that's why it's Mercury's joy of the first. You have the second house. I don't think any planet has a joy in a second. You have the third. The third is the joy of the moon. And I want to cover that more specifically in this episode, so I'm not going to really talk about it now. Then you have the 4th house, one of the angular houses. You have the 5th house, which is the joy of Venus, right? Very creative, very soft. Now, the 3rd and the 5th house are interesting in that they kind of almost represent a masculine, feminine shadow of each other in some ways, and that's something you see more in Vedic astrology, but it's very interesting dynamic that the more I've kind of paid attention to it, after having kind of learned of the conceptualization of it, that I do find quite fascinating. But again, we'll cover that as we look at each house. Then you have the 6th house, which is the joy of Mars, right? It's a very active house, requires hard work. Typically seen as, the 6th and the 12th are typically seen as kind of the hard and difficult houses, with the 5th and the 11th seen as the very benefic houses. You have the 7th, right, which is going to deal with other people. The 8th, again, seen as one of the more tricky houses. The 9th, which is the joy of the sun. The 10th, which is, right, kind of seen as the peak, the pinnacle. The 11th, which is the joy of Jupiter. And then 12th, which is the joy of Saturn. And 12th is considered typically the hardest house. One other thing, and this has to do with visibility. The 12th house and the 8th house are considered kind of dark, even though they're visible in the sky. And this is because they are just above and just below the horizon. And if you look in the distance at things just above the horizon, what you notice is it's hard to see, right? You're blinded by the light of the sun if you're looking at the sunrise. You can't really see anything that's right there. It's kind of hazy and in the distance. Same thing with the setting sun. Right? And so there's a certain invisibility that's going to be associated with those signs, even though everything on the top half, right? Signs 7 through 12 are going to deal with things that are public in nature, right? Public areas of life. Whereas the signs 1 through 6 are going to deal with the more private areas of life. More, I don't want to say more personal, because everything is going to be very personal in terms of the houses. So that's the house systems. I hope that's not too, I know it's a lot of complicated stuff. Honestly, it makes sense as you kind of go through it. As we go through each house individually, that'll certainly clarify a lot of things, I think. But the houses are crucial to our understanding of astrology. Again, it's the way we divide our local space based on the rotation of the earth. And that's what gives it kind of a personal meaning to us. So that's it for today. Next week, we will look at the first house and what that represents and pretty much everything we can kind of get in terms of what it's about. And then we'll go from there. So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. And if you have any questions, if you're looking for a reading, I am a professional astrologer. You can reach me at my website, jdastrology.com, or you can always send me an email, james@jdastrology.com. So thank you very much, and have a great week.